harvest time, the valley's laughter abruptly ceased. For generations, farmers had cursed the frost for heaving plow-shattering stones to the surface, wasting their springs violently hurling the devil's gravel into the gorge. Asher had been the only one to break the cycle. The town had branded him a madman when he stopped throwing the rocks away and began hoarding the nuisance, right up until they saw exactly what he was building. The tractor stalled with a sound like a dying dog, a harsh mechanical cough, followed by the sickening crunch of metal snapping against granite. Asher killed the ignition. He didn't swear. He was too tired to swear. He just sat there in the cracked vinyl seat, smelling the hot diesel and the acrid tang of burnt clutch. The wind, relentless and carrying the sharp bite of early April, whipped across the open cab. It picked up the dry, loose topsoil he had just spent 3 hours trying to turn, blowing it directly into his eyes. He tasted grit. He always tasted grit. Climbing down from the cab, his right knee popped. It was a familiar, dull ache that started in his cartilage and radiated up into his lower back. His boots sank into the loose dirt, but beneath the thin veneer of soil, the ground was hard, unforgiving. He walked to the back of the plow. The shear pin was gone. The heavy steel blade of the plowshare was bent backward, jammed against a lump of gray limestone the size of a microwave. Asher crouched. He didn't wear gloves. He hadn't for years. The calluses on his palms were thick, yellowed, and cracked, permanently stained with a mixture of grease and loam. He dug his fingers into the cold earth around the stone. The soil was powdery, dead. The westerly wind, they just called it the howl out here, stripped the moisture from the dirt the moment the snow melted. Whatever fertilizer they sprayed, whatever manure they laid down, the howl took half of it and deposited it into the neighboring county. He pulled at the rock. It didn't budge. He walked back to the tractor, grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the toolbox, and returned to the furrow. He jammed the bar under the limestone, put his shoulder against the iron, and pushed. The resistance was immediate. The earth didn't want to let it go. Veins bulged in Asher's neck. His breath came out in short, ragged plumes of white mist. With a wet, sucking sound, the rock finally broke free, rolling out of its crater and coming to rest against his boot. It was heavy, maybe 80 pounds. Standard practice in the valley was simple. You hit a rock, you dug it out, you threw it in the bucket of the front loader, and when the bucket was full, you drove to the eastern edge of the property, where the land dropped off into Miller's Ravine. You dumped the rocks, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them over the decades. Asher's father had done it. His grandfather had done it. The ravine was a graveyard of broken limestone, quartz, and shale, useless and forgotten. Asher looked at the bucket of his tractor. It was already half full of smaller stones. He looked at the heavy limestone at his feet. Then he looked west, toward the ridge where the wind was currently bending the sparse, skeletal tree line almost 45 degrees. He felt the wind chap his cheeks. He felt it stealing the moisture from his lungs. Asher didn't pick up the rock and put it in the bucket. Instead, he wrestled it up against his thighs, his lower back screaming in protest, the rough edges of the stone tearing at the denim of his jeans. He staggered. He didn't walk toward the tractor. He turned west, toward the windward ridge. It was a 70-yard walk. Every step sent a shockwave of pain up his spine. The rock scraped against his belt buckle. He smelled the damp mineral scent of the stone, cold and ancient. When he reached the property line, marked only by a rusted wire fence that hadn't held cattle since the 80s, he dropped it. The rock hit the ground with a heavy, dead thud. Asher stood over it, hands on his knees, gasping for air. His heart hammered in his ribs. He looked down at the single stone sitting in the sparse, dead grass. It looked pathetic, small, completely inconsequential against the vast, flat expanse of the valley. He didn't know why he did it. It wasn't a sudden burst of genius. There was no grand cinematic score playing in his head. It was just a profound, exhaustive frustration. He hated the wind. He hated the rocks. He hated the feeling that the land was actively trying to kill him, inch by inch, season by season. He walked back to the tractor, replaced the shear pin with cold, numb fingers, and started the engine. 10 minutes later, the plow hit another rock. Asher dug it out. He carried it to the ridge. He set it next to the first one. By the time the sun went down, bleeding a bruised purple across the horizon, Asher had a line of 20 stones resting along the western fence line. His back felt like shattered glass. His hands were bleeding from a dozen microabrasions where the stone had bitten into his skin. His wife, Martha, was waiting on the porch when the tractor finally clattered into the barn. The security light hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face. She wore an oversized wool cardigan that smelled faintly of wood smoke and laundry soap. "You're late," she said, handing him a mug of coffee. It was black and scalding. "Hit a patch of shale in the lower 40, Asher muttered, taking the mug. His hands shook slightly. The heat of the ceramic burned his raw palms, but he welcomed the pain. It grounded him. Martha looked past him, squinting into the gathering dark. "Did you dump the bucket?" "I didn't hear you drive out to the ravine." "No," Asher said. He took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like ash and chicory. "I put them on the ridge." Martha turned back to him, her brow furrowing. "The ridge? Why?" Asher looked down at his boots, coated in a fine layer of gray dust. He didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound insane, just didn't feel like driving to the ravine today. He walked past her into the house, leaving his boots on the porch. He didn't tell her that tomorrow he was going to do it again. November brought the frost, turning the topsoil into a layer of iron. Farming stopped. This was the time for maintenance, for sitting in the heated shop grinding mower blades and arguing with creditors on the telephone. Asher didn't stay in the shop. Every morning, before the sun crested the eastern hills, he took the old flatbed truck out into the fields. The ground was littered with surface rocks, the ones the plow hadn't hit, the ones the frost had pushed up like morbid gray acne across the landscape. The cold was a physical presence. It wasn't a crisp, refreshing chill. It was a damp, invasive cold that seeped through 3 layers of flannel and settled in the marrow of his bones. His breath froze on his mustache. The truck's heater barely worked, blowing a pathetic wheeze of lukewarm air against the frosted windshield. He would park the truck in the middle of the field, leave it idling, smelling the rich, heavy exhaust, and begin lifting. He wore heavy leather work gloves now, but the stones were covered in a thin layer of rime ice, making them slippery. They weighed anywhere from 10 to 100 pounds. He lifted them, carried them to the truck, and threw them onto the wooden bed. The sound of stone hitting wood was a dull, rhythmic percussion that echoed across the empty valley. Hayes, the neighbor to the north, drove by in his new enclosed cab John Deere one morning. The tractor had GPS and climate control. Hayes rolled the window down just enough to let his voice out, keeping the heat in. "Pendleton!" Hayes shouted over the rumble of his engine. "What the hell are you doing out here? Ground's frozen solid." Asher paused, a 50-pound slab of quartz resting against his hip. He looked at Hayes, then at the heated cab. He felt a sudden, ugly flare of resentment. "Clearing rocks," Asher yelled back. "Take him to the ravine," Hayes yelled. "You're wasting gas hauling them anywhere else." "I'm putting them on the ridge." Hayes squinted. "What for?" "Building a wall." Hayes stared at him for a long moment, the exhaust from his tractor billowing around the tires. Then he shook his head, rolled up his window, and drove away. Asher knew exactly what Hayes was thinking. Pendleton's finally cracked. The bank's breathing down his neck and he's out here playing with stones. Asher threw the quartz onto the flatbed. It splintered a piece of the wood siding. He didn't care. He drove the truck to the western ridge. The line of stones he had started in April was still there, looking pathetic. He began stacking. There was no mortar. There was no string line. Asher wasn't a mason. He was just a man with a ruined back and a surplus of anger. He picked up a rock, judged its shape with his eyes, and slammed it down onto the base layer. If it wobbled, he jammed a smaller stone underneath it. He wedged them together, forcing the jagged edges to lock. It was agonizing, slow work. By noon, his fingers were completely numb. By 3 o'clock, his lower back was locked in a solid spasm. He walked with a pronounced limp, favoring his left leg because his right knee felt like it was filled with ground glass. One afternoon, a sharp, triangular piece of shale slipped from his numb fingers. It dropped directly onto his left foot, crushing the steel toe of his boot inward. The pain was instantaneous and blinding, a hot, white flash that dropped him to his knees in the frozen dirt. He sat there, clutching his foot, gasping. The wind tore across the ridge, howling in his ears, biting at his exposed neck. He felt utterly ridiculous. He was a 50-year-old man sitting in the dirt, crying over a crushed toe, building a wall out of garbage rock because he was too stubborn to admit defeat to the weather. He wanted to quit. He wanted to go inside, drink cheap whiskey until the pain dulled, and let the bank take the farm. Let them have the wind. Let them have the dust. But then he looked at the wall. It was only 2 feet high and maybe 40 feet long. It was ugly. It zigzagged slightly. It looked like a scar on the landscape. But as Asher sat there in the dirt, he noticed something. The wind was screaming above his head, tearing through the dead branches of a nearby oak tree. But down here, directly behind the 2-foot pile of stones, the air was almost still. The dry, powdery snow that the wind carried was hitting the windward side of the rocks and stopping, forming a small drift. On Asher's side, the ground was clear. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the rough, freezing surface of the shale. He didn't go inside. He didn't drink the whiskey. He gritted his teeth, stood up on his throbbing foot, picked up another stone, and slammed it into place. Through December, January, and February, the ritual remained the same. Wake at 4. Coffee. Truck. Lift. Stack. The wall grew. It became 3 feet high. Then 4. He started using the tractor's front loader to lift the massive boulders, the ones that weighed a 1/4 ton, rolling them into place as the foundation. Martha watched him from the kitchen window. She didn't try to stop him. She knew Asher better than anyone. She knew that when he got that tight, pale look around his mouth, there was no talking to him. But she worried. She saw how he moved in the evenings, hobbling from the bathroom to the armchair, smelling of deep heat and exhaustion. "You're going to kill yourself out there," she said quietly one night, wrapping a hot towel around his shoulders. Asher closed his eyes, leaning back into the heat. "I'm not. It's just rocks, Artie. It won't change the soil." "Maybe not," Asher said. His voice was hoarse. "But it stops the wind." Spring arrived not with a gentle thaw, but with a violent, muddy upheaval. The snowmelt turned the fields into a thick, sucking soup that smelled of rot and dormant life. Asher stood on the ridge, ankle-deep in mud. The wall was now 5 feet high and stretched for nearly 1/4 of a mile along the western boundary of his main planting field. It was a chaotic, brutalist structure. Moss and gray lichen were already clinging to the northern faces of the older stones. He stood on the leeward side, the side facing his farm. The prevailing westerlies were blowing hard today, a steady 40 miles per hour that rattled the windows of the farmhouse down in the valley. But where Asher stood, 5 feet away from the wall, there was only a gentle breeze. The difference in acoustics was startling. If he stepped around the edge of the wall, the wind roared, a deafening hiss that filled his ears and stole his breath. But stepping back behind the stone barrier, the roar was cut in half, muffled and deflected upward. He touched the stones. It was mid-morning, and the sun had been hitting the dark rocks for a few hours. They were warm, not hot, but they held a distinct, radiant heat that the ambient air lacked. Asher knelt in the mud and scooped up a handful of soil near the base of the wall. Normally, by this time in April, the wind would have dried out the top layer of earth, turning it into the powdery grit he despised. But this soil was dark. It was clumpy. It held together in his palm, smelling rich and slightly metallic. The wall wasn't just blocking the wind. It was changing the temperature. It was holding the moisture. Planting season began 2 weeks later. Asher drove the seeder back and forth across the field. He watched the hopper drop the corn seed into the furrows. Usually, this was an exercise in anxiety. He would watch the dust kick up behind the tractor, knowing that a percentage of his expensive seed and fertilizer was literally blowing away before the furrow even closed. This year, there was no dust cloud. The air over the field was relatively calm. The soil stayed heavy and wet, locking the seeds in the dark earth. In late May, the real test came. The weather sirens in the valley went off at 2 p.m. A severe spring storm system rolled over the mountains, bringing 60-mile-per-hour straight-line winds and sheets of driving rain. Asher and Martha sat on the porch, watching the sky turn the color of a bruised plum. The rain sounded like buckshot against the tin roof of the barn. "Hayes is going to lose his early stalks," Asher murmured, watching the trees thrash violently in the distance. "Don't worry about Hayes," Martha said, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "Worry about us." Asher looked toward the western ridge. The wall was a dark, solid line against the gray fury of the storm. He couldn't see the young corn stalks from here. They were only 6 inches high, fragile and green. A wind like this usually snapped them at the base, forcing farmers to replant and lose 3 weeks of the growing season. The storm raged for 2 hours. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing shingles off the toolshed roof and sending a plastic garbage can tumbling a half-mile down the county road. When it finally broke, leaving behind a heavy, humid silence and the smell of ozone, Asher walked out into the field. His boots squelched in the saturated earth. He crested the slight rise near the center of the acreage and looked toward the wall. The wind had hit the stone barrier with everything it had. On the windward side, Asher knew the ground would be scoured clean. But on his side, the leeward side, the young cornstalks were standing. They were battered. A few were bent, but they were not broken. The wall had acted as a ramp. The violent wind had hit the 5-foot stone face and been forced upward, creating a buffer of turbulent but slower-moving air directly over the crop. It had sheared off the worst of the velocity. Asher walked down the rows. He reached out and touched a vibrant green leaf, beaded with heavy raindrops. It was intact. The soil around the base of the stalk hadn't washed out. It hadn't blown away. He looked up at the wall. It was ugly. It was crooked. It had cost him a broken toe, a permanently damaged lower back, and hundreds of hours of agonizing labor. It looked like the work of a madman. Asher smiled. It was a thin, tight smile, exposing teeth that hadn't seen a dentist in 5 years, but it was genuine. The next day, Hayes's truck pulled into Asher's driveway. The mud was thick, and the truck fishtailed slightly before coming to a stop. Hayes got out. He looked haggard. He was chewing on an unlit cigar, his boots caked in wet clay. Asher walked out of the barn, a grease rag in his hand. "Lost 40% of my lower field," Hayes said, skipping the pleasantries. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual booming arrogance. Wind snapped them right at the dirt line. "Gotta reseed." Asher didn't gloat. He didn't feel the need to. "Sorry to hear that, Tom." Hayes looked past Asher, his eyes tracing the long gray line of the stone wall on the ridge. He stared at it for a long time. The only sound was the drip of water from the barn eaves. "I drove past your western acreage this morning," Hayes said slowly. "Your stalks are up." "They survived," Asher said simply. Hayes took the cigar out of his mouth. He looked at the wall, then looked at Asher's hands, the thick, scarred knuckles, the fingernails packed with grease and soil. "How much rock you figure is in that thing?" Hayes asked. "Enough," Asher said. Hayes nodded slowly. He didn't mock him this time. He just turned, got back in his truck, and drove away. Asher watched him go, then turned his gaze back to the ridge. The wall stood there, silent and immovable. It wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a monument to spite, built from the very things the land had tried to break him with. And as the early summer sun hit the stones, warming the damp earth beneath them, Asher realized he still had the eastern ridge to clear. July descended on the valley like a wet wool blanket. The heat didn't just radiate from the sky. It baked into the crust of the earth and reflected back upward in shimmering, distortion-heavy waves. Cicadas screamed in the tree lines, a relentless electric buzz that drilled into the skull. Asher's western acreage looked alien. Throughout the rest of the county, the corn was struggling. A 3-week dry spell had turned the soil pale and brittle. Leaves were curling inward, a defensive posture against the brutal sun, trying to conserve whatever microscopic beads of moisture remained. The stalks were pale, a sickly yellow-green that spoke of nitrogen deficiency and stress. Behind Asher's wall, the corn was a dark, bruised emerald. He walked into the rows on a Tuesday afternoon. The temperature was 94 degrees in the shade, but stepping into the cornfield felt like walking into a terrarium. The air was thick, heavy in his lungs, smelling intensely of chlorophyll, damp earth, and the faint, sweet decay of lower leaves rotting into the soil. The stalks were 2 feet taller here than on the eastern edge of the property. Asher stopped, disappearing entirely within the dense canopy of broad leaves. He reached down and dug his fingers into the dirt. It wasn't mud, but it was cool. It clumped beneath his fingernails. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. The science of it wasn't complicated, though he hadn't planned it. The 5-foot barrier of jagged limestone and shale was doing 2 things. First, It was entirely killing the ground-level wind that normally acted like a blow-dryer on the soil. Second, the mass of the rock was acting as a thermal battery. During the day, the stones absorbed the ferocious heat. At night, when the valley temperatures plummeted and the dew point dropped, the rocks radiated that stored heat backward over the field. It created a microclimate, a pocket of stagnant, humid, temperature-controlled air that the corn was violently consuming. Asher's body, however, was consuming itself. He stepped out of the rows and walked back toward the farmhouse. His limp was no longer an occasional inconvenience. It was a permanent fixture of his gait. The cartilage in his right knee was essentially gone. Every step was a bone-on-bone grind that sent a sharp, nauseating spike of electricity up his femur. He climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch, gripping the handrail so hard his knuckles turned white. Inside, the kitchen was dark. Martha had the shades drawn to keep the heat out. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the oscillating fan sitting on the linoleum counter. Asher sat heavily at the table, wincing as his lower back compressed. He pulled a bottle of generic ibuprofen from his shirt pocket, tapped 3 white pills into his palm, and dry swallowed them. Martha stood at the sink, snapping green beans into a metal colander. She didn't turn around. Snap, drop, snap, drop. "Greg Miller called," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying the exhaustion that permeated everything in July. From the county extension office. Said he heard some rumors from Hayes at the diner. Wants to come out and look at the western field. "Tell him to stay off my land," Asher rasped. His throat was dry. "I told him you'd be out there tomorrow morning at 8, Martha replied, turning off the faucet. She turned around, leaning her hip against the counter. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the deep, gray bags under his eyes, at the way his shoulders slumped forward, defeated by gravity and pain. "I don't have time for a county agronomist to poke around in my dirt with a clipboard," Asher snapped, a flare of irrational anger rushing to his cheeks. "He's just going to tell me my nitrogen is low and try to sell me a chemical program I can't afford." "He's coming, Artie," Martha said softly, "and you're going to talk to him, because if this crop fails, the bank takes the equipment in November, and if we lose the equipment—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The silence in the kitchen was heavy with the threat of auction gavels and empty bank accounts. Asher rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. Fine. 8 o'clock. The next morning, Greg Miller's crisp white county truck pulled into the dirt driveway. Greg stepped out, looking aggressively clean. He wore a polo shirt tucked into khaki pants, work boots that had never seen actual mud, and sunglasses. He carried a stainless steel soil probe and a digital thermometer. Asher met him by the tractor shed, holding a mug of black coffee. He didn't offer Greg one. "Asher," Greg said, extending a hand. Asher looked at it, then shook it briefly. His calluses scraped against Greg's soft palm. "Greg, let's get this over with. I got a belt on the auger that needs replacing." They walked out to the western field in silence. The morning sun was already beginning to bake the dew off the grass. When they reached the top of the rise, Greg stopped. He took off his sunglasses. He looked at the wall, a jagged gray spine running along the ridge. Then he looked at the corn. The contrast was staggering. The crop near the wall was a towering, impenetrable wall of green. As the field stretched eastward, away from the stone barrier, the stalks gradually tapered down, losing color and height, until the far edge looked like the rest of the drought-stricken county. Greg didn't say a word. He walked to the base of the wall, pushed past the first row of corn, and shoved the soil probe a foot into the earth. He pulled the core sample out and stared at it. "Dark," Greg muttered, crumbling the dirt between his thumb and forefinger. "High organic matter retention. Moisture is, well, it's actually there. The rest of the county is farming concrete right now." He pulled out his digital thermometer and aimed the laser pointer at the stone wall. The red dot danced on a slab of shale. 78 degrees, Greg said. He turned and aimed it at the ambient air over the field. Air temp is already 82. The rocks are cooling the morning air. And at night, they keep the frost off, Asher said, his voice grating. And they stop the howl from blowing my topsoil into the next time zone. Greg walked back to him, putting the tools in his pockets. He looked at Asher, not with pity, but with a strange, clinical awe. "How many tons of rock did you move?" "Didn't weigh it." "You did this by yourself? With a front loader?" And my hands. Greg shook his head. It's a microclimate, Asher. A textbook windbreak and thermal mass combination. You've essentially built a passive greenhouse for 60 acres. He paused, looking back at the wall. It's brilliant, but it's not scalable. No farmer has the time or the labor to build a half-mile of dry stack stone wall. I did, Asher said. He turned around and started limping back to the house, because I was sick of throwing them in the ravine. As he walked away, he heard Greg's voice call out from behind him. Asher, when harvest comes, I want to see the yield monitor. Asher didn't answer. He just kept walking, listening to the popping in his knee and focusing on placing one foot in front of the other. He didn't care about the science. He didn't care about the county extension office's data. He only cared about November. September hit the valley like a hammer, trading the suffocating humidity of summer for a sharp, metallic chill. The cicadas died off, making way for the mechanical roar of internal combustion that echoed across the flatlands. Asher's combine was a 1998 Case IH. It was a lumbering, rusted beast with a steering wheel wrapped in peeling duct tape. The cab perpetually smelled of stale sweat, diesel fuel, and hot hydraulic fluid. He started the harvest on the eastern edge of the property, the bad side. The machine chewed through the stunted stalks with a hollow, rattling cough. Dust billowed from the rear chopper in a thick, choking cloud, coating the rearview mirrors in pale gray powder. Asher sat in the cramped cab, his bad knee throbbing with the vibration of the engine, while the air conditioning blew a wheezy stream of tepid air onto his neck. He watched the grain trickle into the hopper through the small glass window behind his head. It was a pathetic, meager stream. The ears were small, the kernels shriveled and pale, rattling against the metal like dry teeth. It took 2 full grueling passes down the half-mile stretch just to fill the 200-bushel hopper. He dumped the load into an idling semi-trailer, ignoring the hired kid from town who didn't even look up from his phone. Asher turned the combine westward, toward the ridge, toward the jagged stone spine. By noon, the sun had bleached the sky to the color of dirty ice. As he hit the midway point of the acreage, the engine began to bog down. A deep, guttural moan vibrated through the floorboards. The dust cloud behind him vanished, replaced by the heavy, wet smell of bruised stalks and raw, earthy starch. He breached the 60-acre strip directly sheltered by the wall. The combine slammed into the first row. The engine screamed, the RPMs dropping so violently that Asher instinctively slammed the hydrostatic lever backward, slowing the massive machine to a crawl. The stalks here were thick as a man's wrist. The header aggressively stripped the ears, yanking the massive volume of plant matter into the feeder house with a deafening, wet crunch. Asher twisted in his seat, his lower back seizing, and looked through the glass. The grain wasn't trickling. It was erupting, a heavy, violent cascade of dark, burnished gold. The kernels were massive, swollen with moisture and weight, piling up with a terrifying, beautiful speed. He hadn't even finished a 3/4 pass before the hopper-full alarm shrieked a high-pitched, panic-inducing squeal that rattled his teeth. Asher jammed the lever into neutral and killed the separator. His chest heaved. He stared at the flashing red light on the dash, then looked back. The Golden Mountain was crowned, threatening to spill over the sides of the hopper. He grabbed the crackling 2-way radio. "Kid, bring the grain cart to the western ridge." Static hissed. "Can't drive in the field, Mr. Pendleton. Ground's too soft. You gotta come to the end row." Asher's grip on the plastic mic turned his knuckles white. "I can't make it to the end row," he barked, his voice raw and cracking. "I'm full." The harvest of the western field took 3 agonizing days. It should have taken 1. Every 30 minutes, he had to stop, unload, and wait, his rusted combine choking on the sheer volume of the yield. On Thursday morning, Asher drove his rattling pickup into town. He pulled into the county grain elevator, parking beneath massive concrete silos dusted in white powder. Inside, the office was fiercely air-conditioned, smelling distinctly of old coffee and rat poison. Sarah, the weighmaster, sat behind a smudged glass partition. She pushed her reading glasses up her nose and pulled a stack of scale tickets from the loud dot matrix printer. "Morning, Artie," she said, squinting at the top sheet. She tapped her keyboard, looked at her screen, then back at the paper. "Artie, you sure these are all your trucks?" "Same kid driving 'em," Asher said. His cracked hands shook as he took the paper she slid under the glass slot. The county average for dryland corn was 130 bushels an acre. Hayes, relying on GPS, precision spraying, and deep pockets, had pulled in 145. Asher's eastern field had scraped by at a miserable 90. He looked at the bottom line for the 60 acres behind the wall. 212 bushels an acre. It was a statistical anomaly, an impossible number for non-irrigated dirt in this valley. It meant the bank wouldn't take the equipment. It meant survival. Asher didn't pump his fist. He didn't smile. He just felt a sudden, heavy collapse of adrenaline, instantly replaced by the agonizing grind of bone on bone in his right knee. He folded the slip, pushed it into his grease-stained breast pocket, and limped out the door. When he pulled into his driveway, Hayes's pristine truck was idling by the barn. Hayes stood by the tailgate, chewing an unlit cigar. Asher killed his engine and stepped out. He didn't walk over. He just leaned against his door, too exhausted to close it. "Word at the elevator is you broke 200 on the west side," Hayes said. The usual booming arrogance was gone, replaced by a flat, grudging disbelief. "Word travels fast," Asher rasped. Hayes looked toward the ridge. The wall was barely visible through the autumn haze and chopped stalks. "I got a guy coming tomorrow," Hayes said. "Contractor. Going to dig a trench, pour a concrete footer, and build an 8-foot cinder block wall along my north line. Block the wind." Asher let out a dry, rattling laugh. It sounded like a shovel dragging on gravel. "Good plan, Tom," he said. "Concrete footer. Should look real nice." Hayes chewed his cigar. "Cost a fortune, but if it gets me your yields..." Asher didn't bother explaining. A cinder block wall built by a hired crew was just concrete. The dry stack stone wall on the ridge was an exorcism. Hayes was trying to buy a microclimate. Asher had paid for his with cartilage, blood, and a year of his life. Asher walked into the house. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and dried sage. Martha turned from the stove, wiping her hands on a faded apron. Her eyes darted to his face, then down to the folded white paper peeking from his pocket. "We keeping it?" she asked softly. "We're keeping it," Asher said. Martha closed her eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped her. She walked over, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest. Asher flinched as her weight compressed his ruined lower back, but he didn't pull away. He rested his scarred hands on her shoulders, breathing in the scent of wood smoke in her hair. "You did it," she whispered. "Yeah," Asher muttered, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking over her shoulder, out the kitchen window, toward the eastern property line, where the land sloped down into the ravine. The autumn wind was already picking up, rattling the window panes, carrying the bitter promise of January. Beneath that eastern dirt, thousands of jagged limestone rocks were waiting for the deep frost to heave them to the surface. His knee throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. His spine ached. Asher patted Martha's back, his eyes locked on the empty eastern ridge. Tomorrow, he would grease the front loader. He would find his heavy leather gloves. He had another wall to build. Asher's story isn't just about dirt and yield. It's about taking the exact things meant to break you and using them to build a fortress. If this fight against the elements struck a nerve, hit the like button. We all have dead weight to carry, but true grit means stopping and stacking it instead of just throwing it away. Share this video with someone who refuses to quit when the wind howls. Subscribe and click the bell for more raw, grounded stories. Keep building your wall.